Chapter 12 West Africa's Golden Age. Ancient Ghana. A golden age existed in West Africa dating from an early period. Ancient Ghana was situated in today's Mali and southern Mauritania region between the Senegal and Niger rivers. By the 11th century, at the height of its power, the empire also included parts of Senegal and Guinea. The capital was Kumbi Salah, but Nima, Walata, and Autogast were important cities in the region. The Soninkis were main people that dominated this culture for most of its history, but there is some controversy here. The first kings of Ghana ruled from around 300 AD. One African scholar of the 17th century, Asadi, identified these early kings as relatively light-complexioned Berbers. Another African historian, Kati, discusses different theories on the origins of these early kings. He favors the view that they were Sanhaja Berbers and affirms that the early kings ruled from Kumbi, identified as Kumbi Salah. The following statement by Kati indicates the antiquity of this city. I understand on trustworthy evidence that the Kaya Magha were among the most ancient of rulers, of whom 20 reigned before the manifestation of the prophet Muhammad. He lived in the 6th century AD. The name of his capital was Kunbi, which was an important city. Their dynasty came to an end during the 1st century of the Hijra. Modern scholars such as Professor Nahima Lebzian and Professor J.S. Trimmingham have a different view concerning the identity of these early dynasts. They favor the view that these rulers were Sunnites or some other dark-complexioned non-Berber people. Returning to Muhammad Kadi once more. One of the elders told me that the last of them, the Kaya Magha dynasty, was Kanasea, who reigned at the time of the prophet. He had a town called Kurunka, which was the residence of his mother. It is still inhabited. It is said that he had 1,000 horses tied up at his residence. Then Allah brought their rule to an end. He gave the most ignoble of their people power over their nobles. They killed all the children of their kings, even ripping open the women to kill those in the womb. Professor Cheikh Anta Diop interprets the 7th century revolution as the overthrow of a corrupt dynasty by the masses. Other scholars, such as Doctors Davidson, Levitt Zion, and Oliver, failed to comment on the issue in their respective works, but it seems clear that they would not differ significantly from this interpretation. Scholars following the lead given by Kati and Asadi, such as Daniel Chu and Elliot Skinner, interpret the revolution as the violent overthrow of the Sanhaja Berbers by the Soninke. Following as Asadi and Kati, it was thought that the Ghanaian history began about 300 AD. At that time, the capital city was founded, and the first rulers took the dynastic title of Ghana, i.e. king, or Kaya Magha, i.e. king of gold. According to Lar Mayer, author of 2 popular works on African arts and crafts, gold mines were opened in the region of Bure during the early period. Even before 300 AD, however, other things were happening. Archaeological campaigns conducted in the late 1970s have revealed that well before the first kings of ancient Ghana, there were early state-like communities and even early cities. Archaeological work completed in 1984 at 43 sites demonstrated that they belonged to an iron-using culture that dated back to 250 BC. The settlements grew into cities and towns of a considerable longevity and size. Old Djenne was just one of these early cities that dated back to 250 BC. By 500 AD, it had a population of 20,000 people. London, for example, would wait another 700 years to reach this figure. Old Djenne was a center of long-distance trade in which they were the middlemen. Ceramics, copper, foodstuffs, and iron exchanged hands. There was also a trade in gold and salt, 2 very important products in the ancient world. Encircling this early city by year 800 AD was a clay brick wall 9 feet thick. Before long, settlements and workshops grew up around the city, associated with craft specialties such as smiths, potters, sculptors, jewelers, brickmakers, and builders, shipwrights, traders, fishermen, and farmers. The rise of the city was due to a number of factors. It was a It was a transshipment point where goods were transferred from boat to donkey or from donkey to boat. Secondly, it was located near several channels of the Niger River, and this gave it a natural moated defense from easy attack. Thirdly, it could control the movement of products carried along the Niger, such as copper and gold. Copper entered Old Jenne from the east. Gold entered the city from the opposite direction. It was mined in the Bambouk and Bure regions of 600 to 800 kilometers to the southwest. Fourthly, the city was close to overland routes accessed by donkey. Less than 100 kilometers to the east lay a major iron-producing area. Finally, Old Jenne lay between waterways, moist soils, and dry savanna country. In the waterways and moist soils of the inland Niger Delta, fishing and rice growing took place. In the dry savanna country, crops of sorghum, pearl millet, and the like were grown. Even before 250 BC, evidence of a prehistoric Ghanaian culture exists. Large stone masonry villages were excavated in the Dar Tichit-Walata region, north of Kumbi Salah. These villages were built apparently without major external influences. They flourished from around 1100 BC, giving a very early date for the culture, specifically identified by the excavators as Soninke. The villages consisted of roughly circular compounds connected by well-defined streets. They were built near lakes for the accessibility of water and made fishing a viable economic activity. There is also archaeological evidence of herding and agriculture. Between 1000 and 800 BC, archaeological evidence indicates that 4 times as many villages flourished, accompanied by a greater development of agriculture. As before, the villages were large and of stone, but they were also walled. Each village was encircled by a masonry wall over 2 meters high and 1 meter thick. Together with the fact that they were built on hills, this implies that the constructions were for defensive reasons. There is speculation derived from the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus that the Soninques may have suffered sustained hostility from the Garamantes of the desert. This early activity, building and trade, may support the idea of the great German Africanist Professor Leo Frobenius, who reflected that in the 19th century the superstition ruled that all high culture of Africa came from Islam. Since then we have learned much, and we now know today that the beautiful turbans and cloths of the Sudanese, i.e. West African folk, were already used in Africa before Muhammad was even born or before Ethiopian culture reached inner Africa. Since then, we have learned that the peculiar organization of the Sudanese, i.e. West African, states existed long before Islam, and that all the art of building and education, of city organization and handwork in Negro Africa were thousands of years older than those of the Middle Europe. Ancient Ghana began as a kingdom in the 4th century AD, but through territorial conquest, it developed into an empire by the 8th century AD. The empire builders were able to dominate their neighbors by their preeminence in iron technology. Exploiting this advantage for warfare, Soninke military supremacy was assured. They fought with lances and swords of iron against opponents who fought with bars of ebony. Iron also assisted in the development of agriculture. Iron farming tools were superior to alternatives. An Arab writer of the 8th century, Ibn Fazari, called Ghana the land of gold and described its size as equal to that of the Idrisid state of Morocco. Ghana first appears on a map drawn by Al-Khwarizmi before 833 AD. Ghana's wealth was based on an extensive trade network. The city of Kumbi Salah was the center of major trade caravans carrying salt from the Sahara and gold from the Wangara region. Camel caravans came from the north, trekking across the Sahara and laden with salt. Donkey caravans were the most popular throughout the kingdom. From the south, goods were carried on the heads of porters. We speculate that the waterways were also important, especially in the later periods. Barges laden with goods sailed along the Senegal and Niger rivers. On the traffic, the Ghanaian authorities imposed a series of import and export taxes. Each merchant, for example, typically paid 1 dinar of gold, a golden coin, in taxes before being allowed to bring 1 donkey load of salt into Kumbi. Moreover, each merchant had to pay another 2 dinars in gold for the privilege of taking that same donkey load of salt out of Kumbi. Thus, every time a donkey load of salt passed through the capital, the Ghanaian treasury was 3 dinars richer. A dinar was equal to 72 grains of barley. Other goods were taxed. In al-Bakri's time, the going tax rate on every camel or donkey load of copper was about 5/8 of an ounce of gold. General merchandise was taxed at the rate of 1 ounce of gold per load. Ghana also produced one-traded metal goods, cotton cloth, copper, and so-called Morocco leather. The Moroccans sold the leather into Europe, hence the name, but perhaps Ghanaian leather may have been a more appropriate term. Soninke society was divided into castes. Each caste specialized in a different area of economic or work activity. For example, the Kante clan formed the blacksmith caste, the Sise clan were the government caste, etc. Other castes were cattle breeders, farmers, fishermen, or weavers. Ibn Khaldun, the mighty historian of 14th century, discussed the preeminence of Kumbi Salah as follows. At the time of conquest of northern Africa by the Arabs between 639 and 708 AD, some merchants penetrated into the western part of the land of the blacks and found among them no king more powerful than the king of Ghana. His states extended westwards to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Ghana, Kumbe Salah, the capital of this strong, populous nation, was made up of 2 towns and formed one of the greatest and best populated cities in the world. The author of the Book of Roger makes special mention of it, and as does the author of Roads and Kingdoms. Early in the 9th century, the Sanhaja Berbers, a relatively lighter-colored desert people, challenged Ghanaian power. They inhabited the northern frontier of Ghana and therefore controlled much of the Saharan trade between Ghana and North Africa. Autogast was a key city in their possession. Under Tilutain, a great Berber leader, the Sanhaja unified. They established armies to raid Ghana's northern provinces to disrupt the gold trade to Kumbi Salah. Some 10,000 camel-mounted soldiers made these raids. However, this display of Sanhaja unity did not outlive the passing of Tilutain. The Soninques re-established control over their frontier areas, and a century later they seized Autogast from the Berbers. In the 10th century, an Arab geographer, Ibn Hawqal, visited this region and saw for himself the size of the trans-Saharan trade. He was amazed at the enormous transactions of merchants in the region. Writing in 951 AD, he told of a check for 42,000 golden dinars written to a merchant in Autogast by his partner in Sigil-Mesa. He also informs us that the king of Ghana was the richest king on the face of the earth, whose preeminence was due to the quantity of gold nuggets that have been amassed by the ruling Ghana and by his predecessors. One of these golden nuggets was world famous, attracting the attention of the chroniclers of the time. Dr. J.S. Trimmingham informs us that considerable irony that the size of this nugget keeps on increasing. With Al-Idrisi, it reaches the size of a boulder of 30 rodels, to which the king tethered his horse. Ibn Khaldun reports that this boulder, now in possession of the king of Mali, weighed a ton. There was economic reasons why the kings took the gold nuggets. Al-Bakri suggests that without this precaution, gold would become so plentiful that it would practically lose its value. If gold really did lose its value, a smaller quantity of goods could be imported from outside the empire, and therefore standards of living would fall. Ibn Khaldun recommended the Book of the Roads and Kingdoms as a reliable source on Ghana. This work was written in 1067 by Abu Abeid al-Bakri, a well-respected geographer of the Middle Ages. The book contains a fine narrative of ancient Ghana, offering a picture of life in Kumbe Salah a year after the Battle of Hastings. The royal town was called by Muslims Al-Gaba, meaning the forest of grove. Encircled by a wall, the king had a castle and dome buildings. There was a royal court of justice. Near to the court stood a mosque built for visiting Muslims. Outside of Al-Gaba was a guarded area of cottages and groves where the traditional priests kept their icons. The prisons and royal cemeteries were also there. The second town, originally 6 miles away from Al-Gaba, was a Muslim quarter that included 12 mosques. Each institution had its own imams, muezzins, and reciters. One mosque functioned as the Friday Congregational Mosque. Eventually, the space between the two towns became filled with suburbs, creating a large city. Stone houses graced suburbia, standing in gardens. Other buildings were of stone with beams of acacia wood. Al-Bakri alludes to the intellectual activity in the city. There were lawyers and scholars. So enduring was its academic reputation that As-Sadi, the distinguished 17th century chronicler, described Kumbi in retrospect as not only a center of trade caravans, but it was also the resort of the learned, the rich, and the pious of all nations. Of metropolitan color and fashions, al-Bakri describes wrappers of cotton, silk, or brocade worn by the populace, incomes determining who could afford what. We conjecture that the wrappers were draped around the wearers, perhaps in a manner of a toga, as the Ashantis or modern Ghana wear today. There is a celebrated description of Emperor Tunka Menen's court showing a level of wealth that was equaled only by that of the Aegean period. The emperor himself succeeded his aged maternal uncle Bessi in 1063. When he gives audience to his people, says al-Bakri, he sits in a pavilion around which stand his horses caparisoned in cloth of gold. Behind him stand 10 pages holding shields and gold-mounted swords, and on his right hand are the sons of the princes of his empire, splendidly clad and with gold plaited into their hair. The governor of the city is seated on the ground in front of the king, and all around him are the viziers, i.e. ministers, in the same position. The gate of the chamber is guarded by dogs of an excellent breed who never leave the king's seat. They wear collars of gold and silver. Another geographer informs us that it was custom for the emperor to ride around the poorest parts of the city on horseback each morning. He was lavishly attired in jewels and silk, and accompanying him was his entire court. Before them marched a parade of giraffes, elephants, and wild animals. Anyone who had grievance or a petition could address the emperor. The subject's case would be dealt with on the spot. In the afternoon, the emperors rode alone, taking the same route, but all were forbidden to speak to him. The city of Autogast was originally independent of Ghana, but it was captured in 990 AD. The Ghanaians exploited the internal problems for their own advantages, particularly the strife between Zenata Berbers and the Arabs. Ibn Hakal in the 10th century wrote that it was a pleasant place comparable to with Mecca, in that it lies between two hills. Al-Bakri informs us that Autogast was a prosperous caravan center. It was large and densely populated, with some of its people coming from far-off Spain. A place of wealth and comfort, it had very elegant houses, fine public buildings, and several mosques. Meat was plentiful. There were surrounding pastures well stocked with meat and cattle. The rich cultivated wheat as a garden crop. Everybody else grew dora, a rice-like substance. At its markets and also at Kumbi Salah, it was possible to buy wheat imported from the north, cattle, sheep, and honey from the south, and various food products from elsewhere. Merchants imported robes from Morocco and red and blue blouses from Moorish Spain. Goods changed hands on the receipt of gold dust, gold coins, cowrie shells, or salt. Further west in the region of the Senegal River were the city-states of Tekrur and Silla. The relationship of these cities into the Ghanaian Empire is unclear, but it seems that these cities had a semi-independent status. Secondly, Tekrur was more powerful than Silla and dominated the latter. Tekrur probably dates back to around 1st century BC. By the time written records became available, it ruled over a sizable portion of the Senegal River region. According to al-Bakri, on the banks of the Nile, actually the Senegal River, in the town of Tekrur, inhabited by Negroes, these, like the rest of the Negroes, were once pagan, i.e. traditionalists, and worshipped Dakur, in their language meaning idol, i.e. icon. Until the reign of the Warjabi, son of Rabis, this king joined Islam and introduced Islamic law. He enforced the religion upon his subjects. He died in AD 1041. Today, 1067, the Tekrur are Muslims. From Tekrur, one travels to Silla, which likewise consists of 2 towns lying on both banks of the Nile, i.e. Senegal River. Its people are Muslims, having been converted by Warjabi. It is an extensive and populous kingdom, almost equal to that of Ghana. The means of exchange of the inhabitants of Silla are dora, salt, brass rings, and fine cotton strips called shakia. Another chronicler mentions the mode of dress by the Tekrur and Silla. The ordinary people wear woolen kadirware and woolen karazi on their heads, whilst the upper class wear cotton cloth and head wraps. The Almoravides, a veil-wearing, hardline Islamic movement, posed the first serious threat to the power of Ghana. The Ghanaian Empire, after all, had a standing army of 200,000 soldiers with 40,000 cavalry at his disposal. However, Ghanaian rule over Tekrur and the city of Autogas made enemies for the empire in these dependencies that would later rebound on Ghana. Sometime around 1020, a Berber ruler of Autogas converted to Islam. Yahya, his successor, made a pilgrimage to Mecca and met the Islamic cleric Ibn Yasin. Yahya invited the cleric to return to Africa with him to evangelize among the Berbers. It didn't work. The Berbers exiled Ibn Yasin, who was forced to flee to Tekrur. In Tekrur, Ibn Yasin founded his Islamic movement, the Almoravides. Berbers and Tekrur converts flocked to his standard, fired up by both Islam and revenge. The Berbers wanted the independence of Autogas from the non-Islamic rule of Ghana. They also wanted to Islamize by force, if necessary, the Berbers of the desert. On the other hand, the Tekrur wanted their independence from Ghana. A match had been made. By 1055, the Almoravides wrested Autogas from Ghanaian rule. By 1062, they founded the Moroccan city of Marrakesh. In 1076, they declared holy war on Ghana and sacked Kumbi Salah. Finally, the Almoravides conquered Spain and established a ruling dynasty. Professor J.C. de Graaf Johnson, author of the classic African Glory, noted that the invasion of Ghana led to a large numbers of people fleeing further south, such as the Akan, Ashantis, Fantis, etc. This is possibly the reason for ancient and modern Ghana being in 2 different places. Almoravid rule over the empire, however, collapsed in 1087. Their fanaticism lost its zeal. Ghana returned to Soninke leadership, who sparked a brief renaissance, though some of the empire's dependencies had become independent. Al-Idrisi described this period in the Book of Roger, written in 1153. The residence of the Ghanaian Empire at this time, as paraphrased by Lady Luggard, was a well-built castle, thoroughly fortified, decorated inside, with sculptures and pictures, and having glass windows. Al-Idrisi further informs us that Ghana was still a prosperous state that minted its own coins. In his own words, "When the river returns to its bed, everyone sells his gold. The bulk of it is brought by inhabitants of Wardiljan in present-day Libya, and by those from the tip of the West Africa, whither this gold is transported to the mints, coined into dinars, and traded commercially for goods. This is how it happens each year. This is the principal product in land of the blacks. In the country of Wangara, i.e. present-day Guinea, there was flourishing cities and renowned fortresses. Its inhabitants are wealthy. They possess gold in abundance and receive the products brought to them from the other remotest portions of the earth. They attire themselves in robes and other kinds of raiment." We note, however, that the attempted Islamicization by the Almoravides left a major mark on Ghanaian culture, and this became, and it still is, a feature of West African politics. Traditional and Islamic culture was not always compatible by the 12th century. The empire broke up. Some kingdoms, such as Mali and Tekrur, became independent of empire. In 1180, some Soninques established a rival kingdom to Ghana, ruling from the city of Soso. The Soso launched raids on Kumbe Salah in the early 13th century. However, Kumbe Salah and Soso faced a more menacing rival in the newly rising power of Mali. By 1240, the Malians had destroyed both the Soso kingdom and the Ghanaian capital. The fall of Kumbi Salah ended an era in history, and the old capital, later abandoned, became a lost city. Dr. Davidson narrates the story of its rediscovery in our times. As long ago as 1914, a French district officer, Bonel de Mézières, dug into a site that was suggested by tradition. De Mézières found enough to make him believe that this had probably been the capital of Ghana in El Bakri's day, and later excavation has gone far to vindicate him. De Mézières found sarcophagi, tombs of great dimensions, metallurgical workshops, and ruins of towers. Renewed work at this site of Kumbi Salah, continues Davidson, began in 1939. 10 years later, Tamesi and Mani were at last able to undertake a systematic examination of these promising ruins in the light of modern understanding of the matter. By 1951, they had tracked the remains of a large and elaborate Muslim city, which had covered a square mile and have had a population of about 30,000 people, very numerous for the world of 800 and 900 years ago. Dr. Davidson gives no figure for the traditionalist city nearby, nor does he give a population figure for the 6 miles worth of suburbs that separated the two townships. Clearly, the total city population was several times larger than 30,000 people. Archaeology has added yet another twist. Contrary to al-Bakri, the townships were not separated by 6 miles worth of suburbs, rather they were separated by 10 miles worth of suburbs. This makes the total city population even more difficult to calculate. This also shows that the Ibn Khaldun was totally justified in referring to the Ghanaian capital as one of the best populated cities in the world. Of the city itself, M. Denis Pierre de Padrals, the author of Archéologie de l'Afrique Noire, wrote that we can still distinguish clearly the outline of an avenue bordered by houses with walls more than 1 meter or 1.5 meters above ground. The roofs have collapsed. Further on, a strip of flat ground for a public square with walls which seem to have once been supported upper floors. Sometimes the buildings are so well preserved that little would be needed to make them livable again. The other constructions are more complicated. One consists of 5 rooms 4 meters deep with communicating halls. The masonry is perfect. The walls are 30 centimeters thick. Many objects were recovered from the city throughout excavation, including farming tools, fragments of pottery, glass weights for measuring gold, iron lances, knives, nails, painted stone bearing verses from the Quran, and one of the finest pairs of scissors of that era ever to be found in any part of the world. Serge and Denise Roberts, 2 archaeologists, carried out excavations at Tedgast, i.e. Autogast. They inform us that the city was occupied between the 8th and 9th century AD until the 14th century. In the 8th or 9th centuries, Autogast was a village built of clay bricks. From the 9th century, stone-built houses made their appearance. They shared affinities with houses of the Mediterranean. At a later date, it appears that Autogast was significantly rebuilt. The new city combined the layout of the stone houses but now constructed of clay bricks instead, producing a pleasing architectural marriage. McIntosh and McIntosh, the archaeologist who excavated Old Jenne, informs us that excavations at Tedgast and Kumbi Salah revealed stone-built mosques of considerable dimensions. The Kumbi Salah mosques cover 2,000 square meters and could have held over 2,000 people. Before leaving ancient Ghana, we cannot fail to mention some recent intelligence concerning the city of Chinguetti. This city, still in existence today, lay to the north of the ancient Ghanan Empire. Professor Diop drew a map which implied that Chinguetti was fully part of the Ghana Empire, but its far northerly location makes this debatable. It is certain, however, that the city has architecture reminiscent in technique with that of Kumbi Salah. Moreover, the same trade and cultural links that nourished Kumbi Salah fed Chinguetti. With this in mind, an article recently appeared the Sunday Times magazine entitled Writings in the Sand. It is concerned manuscripts in the Arabic language that were collected, written, and read by African Muslims from this region. The shadows lengthen, the Sahara sun begins to set, and the wise old men of Chinguetti settle down to their usual evening reading. In their sun-hardened hands, they hold leather-bound tomes hundreds of years old. The fragile parchment pages are coming out of their binding. The edges are crinkly and torn. But the black ink of the flowing Arabic script stands out boldly as it did when it was first written. To Western eyes, this is Indiana Jones stuff. Ancient texts holding secrets that have been lost over centuries. Though Chinguetti's importance as a commercial post diminished, it is still venerated as Islam's seventh holiest city. Muhammad Habit, an amiable sexgarian, willingly shows visitors into his house where his collection of books is stored. One of them dates from AD 1087 and contains one of the earliest drawings of Makkah, i.e. Mecca, the city where the Prophet Muhammad was born. And this is just one of about 3,450 books in the private libraries of Chinguetti and its neighboring town, Owadane. There are other repositories too, for example, Timbuktu, further east. The Arabic manuscript libraries remain one of the best hidden treasures in Africa, says Professor Charles Stewart, a historian in Illinois University. Though the exact content of the books kept at Chinguetti is not yet known. Stewart approximates that a quarter will be jurisprudence, 10% will be Sufism, mysticism, 10% Arabic language, 10% studies of the Quran, 10% literature, 10% biographies of the Prophet Muhammad and Hadith, tradition, and 10% theology. The remaining 50% is likely to include works on history, logics, ethics, biography, mathematics, astronomy, and astrology, medicine, encyclopedias, education, and geography. They are stored in 3 libraries and 14 private collections. Mali. Ghana is basically a non-Muslim state. The Muslim sectors of its city existed to house the growing number of African converts and also to facilitate the trans-Saharan trade with North Africa. The major state to survive the passing of Ghana was the Islamic State of Mali. In 1240, the Malians, also called Mandingas, led by the Sundiata Keita, seized Ghana's capital, Kumbi-Sala. They became the new masters of the gold and salt trade. At a later date, they opened the copper mines of Takeda as an additional source of revenue. Chroniclers of the time attested to the importance of the trade. Ibn Khaldun, undisputed lord of the medieval historians, wrote that the camel caravans trekked across the Sahara by the way of the Hagar Mountains, 1.5 dozen well-used trade roads. Each year, no fewer than 12,000 camels were counted on one of the routes. Mali, at its height in the 14th century, included the lands now called Senegal, Gambia, Mauritania, and Niger. In short, the second largest empire in the world of the 14th century, comparable in size to all its Western European combined. Ibn Battuta, the famous Muslim travel writer of the Middle Ages, favorably described the Malians as follows. The Negroes are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Their sultan shows no mercy to anyone who is guilty of the least act of it. There is complete security in their country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant in it has anything to fear from the robbers or men of violence. The early history of the Mandinga kingdom is traditionally said to date from 1050 AD. This does not in fact date its beginnings, but rather the rule of Bara Mandana, the first of its Islamic kings. He urged his successors to become Muslims. One such king was Musa Keita, who was said to have visited Mecca 4 times on religious pilgrimages. Dr. Trimmingham believes that the Keita dynasty had its origins earlier than the period of Baramandana. He believes that the dynasty began as early as the 9th century. The founder of the line was Kabbalah Simbo Keita. Herman Bell, in an insightful essay, had this to say on the pre-Islamic religions of Mali. Foremost among the traditional gods is Pharaoh, who bears a remarkable, though probably coincidental, resemblance to the ancient Egyptian god Osiris. Both these gods were associated with the river and fertility. Both were dismembered, and where bits of their bodies were buried, there arose centers devoted to their cult, in one case along the Niger, and in the other along the Nile. This burgeoning kingdom, however, faced problems from rival powers. In 1224, Suman Guru led the Sosa and devastating raid on the Malian capital of Djerba. They razed the city and killed most of the ruling family. 11 princes were put to death in a massacre, but Sumanguru spared one of them, a crippled boy called Sundiata. 6 years later, Sundiata triumphed over his disability and became the ruler of the Malians. He surrounded himself with a private guard made up of the thuggish element of the kingdom and began a guerrilla campaign against Sosa dominance. Sundiata's first strike, however, was against Sangarian, a neighboring kingdom. After the conquest, he campaigned against Labe and also the Niger region. During these conquests, he gathered an army recruited from among the defeated peoples to fight the Sosa. In 1235, he challenged the power of the Sosa at the Battle of Kirina. His armies defeated Sumanguru and destroyed the fortified and well-garrisoned capital of the Sosa. 5 years later, Sundiata seized the city of Ghana and destroyed it. After these military actions, he returned to the ruins of his capital city, Jeraba, and received the sworn loyalty of the rulers of the conquered people at the triumphant and impressive ceremony. He allowed the Emperor of Ghana to retain the title of king. All the other former rulers were given new titles. Sundiata never again took the battlefield. Devoting his time to economic and social development of the empire, he turned his armies into farmers and encouraged a program of agricultural expansion. The soldiers grew cotton, peanuts, and grains, and were also encouraged to raise poultry and cattle. He founded a new capital city called Niani. It was located on the confluence of the upper Niger and San Karini rivers. There were other military actions, however, but Sundiata's generals led them. They marched as far as the Atlantic, seized lands way to the east, subjugated the southern forest belt, and overpowered the desert regions of the north. These actions led to Malian control of the gold fields of Wangara and created the trade route from there to the new capital of Niani. Mansa Wali succeeded Sundiata in 1255. He was the first ruler to take the royal title of Mansa. Wali's reign was largely tranquil, though there were conquests of Bambouk and Bandu. A devout Muslim, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He died in 1270, and 4 undistinguished rulers followed him. There were disputes, power struggles, and many examples of poor management. During this confusion, a freed slave proclaimed himself Mansa of Mali in 1285. This distinguished man, Mansa Sakura, campaigned against Tekrur, raided the Gao region, and may also have pacified Takeda, the famous copper-producing center. The empire became prosperous under his reign, attracting merchants from the Middle East and elsewhere in Africa to trade. Unfortunately, Sakura was assassinated in Somalia after returning from a religious pilgrimage in 1300. In 1999, the BBC produced an outstanding television series entitled Millennium. Based around the historical scholarship of the Oxford University historian Dr. Felipe Fernandez Ernesto, the program devoted to the 14th century opens with the following disclosure. In the 14th century, the century of the scythe, natural disasters threatened civilizations with extinction. The Black Death kills more people in Europe, Asia, and North Africa than any catastrophe has before. Civilizations which avoid the plague thrive. In West Africa, the Empire of Mali becomes the richest in the world. Control over the gold mines was the most important source of this wealth, Dr. Finch informs us. Much alluvial gold was panned, but most of the ore was obtained by sinking shafts sometimes 100 feet deep, often linked by side shafts and galleries. It is estimated that the total amount of gold mined in West Africa up to 1500 was 3,500 tons, worth more than $30 billion in today's market, i.e. 1998. An Egyptian scholar, Ibn Fadal al-Umari, published Masalik ab-Absar fi Mamalik al-Amasar in Cairo around 1342. In the 10th chapter of this work, there is an account of 2 large maritime voyages ordered by the predecessor of Mansa Musa, a king who inherited the Malian throne in 1312. The mariner king is not named by al-Umari, but modern writers identify him as Mansa Abu Bakari II. According to al-Umari, the king launched 200 ships filled with men and a further 200 ships amply stocked with food, gold, and water to last for 2 years. The ruler sent them with a mission to explore the extremity of the Atlantic Ocean. In time, 1 ship returned. Its captain told the Malian king of his adventures. "Prince," he said, We sailed for a long time, up to the moment when we encountered in mid-ocean something like a river with a violent current. My ship was last. The others sailed on, and gradually each of them entered this place. They disappeared and did not come back. We did not know what had happened to them. As for me, I returned to where I was and did not enter the current. The Mansa decided to see for himself. He had 2,000 ships prepared, 1,000 of which were equipped with provisions. They set sail across the Atlantic with a large party and never returned. Abu Bakr II left Mansa Musa I in charge of leading the empire. This account implies that the Malians visited the Americas in 1311. This was 181 years before Christopher Columbus discovered the continent. It is, of course, well known that Columbus himself was fully aware of this important fact. Columbus, to give just one example, reported that he acquired metal goods of West African manufacture from the Native Americans. Other evidence of this African voyage comes from an analysis of maps. Old maps of the Mexico region, drawn by Europeans, show that the Malians renamed places in the region after themselves. Names such as Mandinga Port, Mandinga Bay, and Sierra de Mali exist as place names. Moreover, 2 skeletons of Negro males have been recovered from a grave in Hall Bay near the Danish Virgin Islands. Dated at 1250 AD, this is only 61 years away from the period of proposed Malian visit. In addition, an old inscription was discovered at the bottom of a waterfall in Reef Bay Valley, not too far from the African skeletons. This inscription was written in an old African script called Tifinagh. Originally of the ancient Libyan origin, a Berber group in Mali used this script at a time. This inscription translates as follows: plunge in to cleanse yourself. This is water for purification before prayer. Finally, the scholarly art historian Count Alexander von Wuthenau directed attention to the 14th century carvings that were found in the Americas. These sculptures show men and women, clearly African, wearing turbans. Many have tattoo marks cut into their cheeks. This art may well depict people from Mali. Mansa Musa I ascended the throne in 1312. He was perhaps the most colorful personality in West African history. Of this monarch, Dr. de Graaf Johnson wrote that it was in 1324 that the world awoke to the splendor and grandeur of Mali. There across the African desert and making its way to the Mecca was a caravan of a size which had never been before seen. A caravan consisting of 60,000 men. They were Mansa Musa's men, and Mansa Musa was with them. He was not going to war, he was merely going to worship in Mecca. The huge caravan included a personal retinue of 12,000 slaves, all dressed in brocade and Persian silk. Mansa Musa himself rode on horseback, and directly preceding him were 500 slaves, each carrying a staff of gold weighing about 6 pounds, 500 mitkal. Then came Mansa Musa's baggage train of 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds, 3 kantar, weight of gold dust. This imposing caravan made its way from the Niani on the upper Niger to Walata, then to Tuat, and then on to Cairo. Mansa Musa's piety and open-handed generosity, the fine clothes and good behavior of his followers, all quickly made a good impression. One might have thought that a pilgrimage to Mecca undertaken with such pomp and ceremony would have ulterior political motives, but no such motives have been adduced. In Egypt, Musa spent so much money in gold that he devastated the nation's economy. For years after Mansa Musa's visit, continues Professor de Graaf Johnson, ordinary people in the streets of Cairo, Mecca, Baghdad talked about this wonderful pilgrimage, a pilgrimage which led to the devaluation of gold in the Middle East for several years. In a recent book, Cynthia Crossan, senior editor of a prestigious financial newspaper, Wall Street Journal, wrote, "You've heard about the extraordinary wealth of Bill Gates, J.P. Morgan, and the Sultan of Brunei. But have you heard of Mansa Musa, one of the richest men who have ever lived?" Continuing this theme, Mrs. Crossan comments that neither producer nor inventor, Mansa Musa was an early broker greasing the wheels of intercultural trade. He created wealth by making it possible for others to buy and sell. Dr. Davidson suggested that the rulers of the Mali were rumored to have been the wealthiest men on the face of the earth. During his return journey from Mecca, Musa heard news that his army captured Gao in 1325. Sagmandia, one of his generals, led the victorious invasion. The captured city of Gao was a great prize. Ali Drisi, the distinguished author mentioned earlier, described it as a populous, unwalled commercial and industrial town in which were to be found the produce of all arts and trades necessary for its inhabitants. Tim Insall from St. John's College, Cambridge University, carried out important excavations in Gal. Some of his finds were on display at the British Museum at the time of one of our visits. Particularly intriguing was an exhibit entitled Fragments of Alabaster Window Surrounds and a Piece of Pink Window Glass, Gal 10th to 14th century. Musa made a detour and visited the captured metropolis. In the city, he received the two sons of the Gal king as hostages, Ali Colin and Suleiman the Nar. He returned to Niani with the two boys and later educated them at his court. Mali was divided into provinces governed by Berbers. The chief municipalities were ruled by inspectors known as mokrifs. Law and order prevailed in the provinces, and merchants and their caravans traveled freely. They had little to fear from banditry. There were also vassal kingdoms not under direct imperial rule, such as Jenne. During the time of Musa I, there were between 13 and 24 of these semi-independent kingdoms in alliance with the empire. The Mansa maintained a standing army of 100,000 men, of which 10% were cavalrymen. They were mounted on camels and horses. Musa I embarked on a large building program, raising mosques and universities in Timbuktu and Gal. In Niani, he built the Hall of Audience, a building communicated by an interior door to the royal palace. It was an admirable monument. Surmounted by a dome adorned with arabesques of striking colors, the windows of an upper floor were plated with wood and framed in silver foil. Those of a lower floor were plated with wood and framed in gold. Like the great mosque, a splendid monument of Timbuktu, the hall was built of cut stone. During this period, there were an extraordinary level of urban living. Sergio Domain, an Italian art and architecture scholar, wrote the following about this period. Thus was laid the foundation of an urban civilization. At the height of its power, Mali had at least 400 cities, and the interior of the Niger Delta was very densely populated. Timbuktu rose from obscurity to commercial and cultural importance. It had caravan connections to Angola, Draa, Egypt, Fez, Fezzan, Gadamer, Sijil Mesa, Sus, and Tuat. In addition, it became a center of learning of one of the Sankor mosques was highly distinguished for the teaching of Quranic theology and law, besides other subjects such as astronomy and mathematics. Musa I promoted the spread of Islam and made the Eid celebrations at the end of the Ramadan a national holiday. Despite his religiosity, Musa was not fanatical. Professor Jackson wrote the following that demonstrates the Mansa's pragmatic attitude towards religion. On one occasion, Mansa Musa sent a representative to the gold miners of Wangara, who were pagans, i.e. traditionalists, for the purpose of converting them to the Muslim faith. On the return of the special messenger, the monarch eagerly awaited his reply, and this is what he heard. Your Majesty, this is not the time to pursue the Wangara people to the south. They have refused to accept our faith. The miners of Wangara even threatened to stop producing gold if they were forced to become Muslims. It would not be wise to try to force them. The Wangara are skilled at forest fighting. They use poisoned arrows. The tsetse fly that brings the deadly sleeping sickness could destroy our army. This message did not please Mansa Musa, but he had genuine respect for the rights of all the people and deemed it right to follow the advice of his courier. Towards the end of his reign, Musa initiated diplomatic links with Morocco, sending a deputation to the court of al-Sultan Aswad, i.e. the Black Sultan. Abu el-Hassan Ali, the Moroccan court respondent, sending presents to Mali, typical of the finest of their kingdom and carefully chosen by their sultan. The Honorable Ibn Ghanem led a deputation of the eminent to deliver the magnificent offering. Alas, Musa died in 1337 before the Moroccan envoy arrived. His successor, Mansa Magan, received the gift. A tradition of exchanging presents between the two courts continued for many generations. Mansa Magan became the ruler in 1337. The following year, the Mahsi of Burkina Faso raided Timbuktu. They routed the Mali garrison and torched the city. Other problems emerged. The two Gal princes escaped. They fled to Gal and at later date declared their independence from Mali. Mansa Suleiman became the next ruler in 1341. His 18-year rule was one of stability, though he did not have to contend with the Berbers of the desert. The desert dwellers seized Walata. They also raided Mali and controlled Tekrur. It was during the Suleiman period that Ibn Battuta, the most acclaimed traveler of the age, visited the country. Not only is Ibn Battuta's Travels in Asia and Africa a classic, it contains some of the best eyewitness details of life in Mali during this period. For this reason, we feel justified in reproducing the following extracts for his precious work. I travel, says Ibn Battuta, with travel companions whose leader was Abu Muhammad Yandankin al-Masufi. May God have mercy on him. In the company was a group of merchants of Silgamessa and others. We arrived after 25 days at Tughaza. It is a village with no good in it. Amongst its curiosities is the fact that the construction of its houses and the mosque is of rock salt with camel skin roofing. In it is a salt mine. It is dug out of the ground and is found there in huge slabs. A camel can carry 2 slabs of salt. The blacks, i.e. Malians, arrive from their country and carry away the salt. A camel load of it is sold in Walata for from 8 to 10 mithqals, and in town of Mali, i.e. Naini, for 20 or 30 mithqals. Perhaps the price reaches up to 40. The blacks exchange the salt as money as one would exchange gold and silver. They cut it up and trade it with pieces. Ibn Battuta witnessed various festivals while in the empire. On Fridays, the Mansa held festivals after the late afternoon prayers. Ibn Battuta tells us what happened. The Sultan holds sessions during the days associated with the 2 festivals after the Asir, late afternoon prayers, on the Banbi, i.e. platform. The men at arms come with wonderful weaponry, quivers of silver and gold, swords covered with gold, their sheaths of the same, spears of silver and gold, and wands of crystal. 4 of the emirs stand behind him to drive off flies with ornaments of silver in their hands which look like riding stirrups. The Fararia commanders, the Cadi, i.e. judge, and the preacher sit according to custom. The interpreter Dugha brings in his, i.e. the Mansa's, 4 wives and his concubines, who are about 100 in number. On them are fine cloths, and on their heads they have bands of silver and gold with silver and gold apples as pendants. A chair is set there for Dugha to sit on, and he beats an instrument which is made of reeds with tiny calabashes below it, praising the Sultan, recalling in his song his expeditions and deeds. The wives and the concubines sing with him, and they play with bows. There are with them about 30 of his pages wearing red woolen robes and white caps on their heads. Each one of them has a drum tied to him, and he beats it. Then come his retinue of young men, who play and turn in the air as they do in the Sind, i.e. India. They have a wonderful gracefulness and lightness in this. They juggle with swords beautifully, and Dugha performs a marvelous game with a sword. At that point, the Sultan orders that a gift be given him. They bring him a purse of 200 mithqals of gold dust. An announcement of its contents is made to him over the heads of the people. The Faria commanders get up and twang their bows, thanking the Sultan. On the following day, every one of them makes a gift to Dugha according to his means. After his visit to Walata, Ibn Battuta described the women as extremely beautiful and are more important than the men. He continues in the like vein. The condition of these people is strange, and their manners outlandish. As for their men, there is no sexual jealousy in them, and none of them derives his genealogy from his father, but on the contrary from his maternal uncle. A man does not pass on inheritance except to his sons of his sister, to the exclusion of his own sons. Now that is a thing I have never saw in any part of the world except in the country of the unbelievers of the land of Malabar, among the Indians. Some scholars believe that Ibn Battuta appears to be describing a matriarchal social order operating in Mali. Other evidence that supports this interpretation comes from an anecdote, again from Ibn Battuta's pen. It came about that in the days of my stay in Mali, that the Sultan, i.e. Mansa Suleiman, was angry with his senior wife, the daughter of his paternal uncle, who was called Kesa, which signifies the queen among them. The queen is his partner in the kingship, following the custom of the blacks. Her name is mentioned with this in the pulpit. Saeed Hamdan and Noel King, the translators of Ibn Battuta's narrative, comment on this passage as follows. Civil war broke out on the death of Mansa Suleiman, lasting 9 months. Mari Jata II became king in 1360 after defeating a rival. He cultivated the friendship of the court of Morocco. He sent them a giraffe, which created a stir after following a precarious journey across the Sahara. He also maintained friendly relations with Egypt. However, severe economic problems emerged during this reign. The king sold the largest golden nugget in the government's possession to Egyptian merchants for a knockdown price. The sale bankrupted the treasury. Incidentally, this was world-famous nugget that was originally part of the Ghanaian emperor's treasury hundreds of years before. In 1374, Mansa Musa II succeeded him on paper, but in practice played very little political role. Keeping the Mansa in seclusion, the prime minister, yet another Mari Jata, ruled the empire. Mari Jata suppressed a Tuareg rebellion in Takeda and commanded raids on Gao. This prime minister was the last great ruler of Mali before things fell apart. Stride and Ifka inform us that, with Magan III's accession in 1390, our knowledge of Mali rulers ends and interest focuses on the disastrous results of Mali's disunity. The Soninke state of Diarra threw off the Mali yoke, and the Masi, Tuareg, and Songhai mounted increasingly successful pressure on the empire. In about 1400, the Masi of Burkina Faso plundered deep into the Masina, where the Songhai and last emerged from their long struggle to preserve the independence of Gao and began to occupy Mali territory. The Tuareg seized the commercial towns of Arwan, Walata, and Timbuktu in about 1433 and ruined Mali's control of the trans-Saharan trade. Songhai. Songhai was the last of the vast West African empires, originally a tributary state within the Malian Empire. It became independent as Mali declined. The Songhai Empire dominated West Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries, taking over from Mali. The Songhai, however, had a long and interesting early history that is well worth investigating. The first Songhai dynasty was called the Dia, ruling from 690 AD until 1338. Kukya was their capital city. It was very ancient. Asa Asadi, the important African historian, informs us that it existed during the time of pharaohs. Louis de Plange, a modern archaeologist, found vestiges of it in modern-day Mali. By the 9th century, Gao, a rival Songhai city, had become much more powerful. It was a great trading city that attracted caravans and merchants from Morocco, Tunis, and Egypt. Gao was divided into two main sections based on religion, just like the old Ghanaian capital, Kumbi Salah. Gao, however, was more than just a city. It had become the center of an early empire. One of the Arab writers of the 9th century wrote that Gao is the greatest sovereignty of Negroes, the most important and influential, to whom the other kingdoms pay allegiance. Subject to this king are a number of kingdoms which pay him allegiance and acknowledge his overlordship. Among them is the kingdom of Mara, which is extensive, whose king has a capital called Al-Haya, and the kingdoms of Murdia, Al-Harbar, Sanhaja, Nadkari, Al-Sanyur, Arwar, Takarut, and all these are dependencies of the kingdom of Gao. The 15th ruler of Kukya, Dia Kosai, moved the capital to Gao in the early thousands. Joining the two kingdoms in 1009, Kosai became Kukya's first Islamic king. He appointed Muslims to governmental positions. Lady Luggard was very impressed with this era. The Songhai kingdom, wrote her ladyship, flourished exceedingly under the Mohammedan Zas, i.e. Dias. Their capital was, of all the cities of the blacks, that which had the most gold. It had also an abundance of cotton and rice. During this period, the rulers received a sword, a seal, and Quran on their coronation. All came from the Islamic-dominated Spain. In 1325, the Malians captured Gao and absorbed it into their empire. In around 1338, Soni Ali Colon establishes of the new dynasty and, at a later date, declares independence from Mali. In 1464, Soni Ali, the 18th ruler of this line, became ruler of the Songhai kingdom. His first notable achievement was the capture of the city of Timbuktu in 1469. With its world-famous University of Sankore Mosque, Jenne was the next city to fall after a siege lasting over 7 years. An even bigger prize, it had an international trading links, a university, and also the most brilliant architecture in the region. He took it around 1473. To the south lay kingdoms of the Masi, an enemy of the Songhai. In 1480, they launched a raid on the Songhai city of Wallada. They besieged the city for a month, leading Wallada to capitulate. The victorious Masi seized people and booty. In 1483, Sani Ali's army successfully drove the menace from the kingdom. Sani Ali established the Songhai state as the third great West African empire in this region. He became a world-famous leader of this time. Taking over most of the old Malian Empire, after a distinguished career, he died in November 1492, killed in a military campaign. He was mummified after his death and thus followed very ancient African tradition. Soni Baru Dao, the son of Soni Ali, was also a follower of traditional African religion. He rejected all attempts to convert him to Islam by Muslims in his empire. After several weeks of negotiations and no conversion, the Muslims resorted to battle. Backed by a large section of the army, the Muslims triumphed in April 1493. This brought Muhammad Touré, a former general, to lead the empire. He took the title Askia, and all those who followed him took the same dynastic title. A devout Muslim, Askia Muhammad I made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1496. 1,000 infantry and cavalry detached of 500 horsemen accompanied him. He also took 300,000 gold pieces. In Mecca, Askia met the Caliph of Egypt, the Pope of the Islamic Church. Askia requested that the Caliph appoint him as his religious representative in West Africa. The Caliph agreed. Askia Muhammad returned to Gao in 1497 with a new title. He was now the Caliph of the Western Sudan, spiritual ruler of all the West African Muslims. The empire Askia inherited from the Soni dynasty was already massive, yet he expanded north, east and west by conquest. Ultimately, it would cover an area about the same size of all of Europe. By 1514, his armies captured the Hausa Confederation of northern Nigeria. Next to capitulate was the city of Agades in Niger, and finally the regions of the far west of the empire around the Atlantic. As the kingdom grew into an empire, Askia Muhammad I came up with the new methods of government, establishing a strong, centralized administration. Among the most important posts were the Minister of Treasury, the Minister of Tax Collection, the Minister of the Army and Navy, and the Minister of Trade and Industry. In some territories, the Askia allowed the regional kings to rule as they had before, just as long as they paid tribute. In other territories, the Askia created a parallel post to the local governor called the Mondio, i.e. inspector, who formed the official link to the imperial Songhai government. Askia Muhammad I died in 1538 and was buried in a step pyramid at Gao. He is fondly remembered as Askia the Great. Gao at this time housed a population of 100,000 people. According to Leo Africanus, a Moorish visitor, it was unwalled. Its houses were ugly, but a few, such as the royal buildings and the like, were impressive. The inhabitants were mostly wealthy merchants who always traveled here and there to trade gold and wares. Bread, meat, and particular rice were greatly abundant. Cucumbers, melons, and fine pumpkins were plentiful, as were wells of fresh water. On market days, there was a place where a busy slave market flourished. Timbuktu had fairly spacious houses built of clay bricks, wood, and plaster. There were 3 famous mosques in the city. The great Malian king, Mansa Musa, built the Jingobere Mosque in the 14th century. It was an eerie 9-aisle building looking somewhat like a fortress. There was the University Mosque, in which 25,000 students studied, and the Oratory of Sidi Yahya. There were over 150 Quran schools in which 20,000 children were instructed. In addition, factories flourished, especially in the textile industry, which made goods of cotton, cloth, and linen. Some of these institutions employed up to 100 apprentices under the guidance of the master tailor. The palace itself was enlarged and embellished by Askia Bengan, a successor of Askia Muhammad I, with courtiers employed in even greater numbers, whose habits of dress became sumptuous, and it would seem from incidental allusions that different functionaries had their different uniforms and insignia of office, to the wearing of which great value was attached. The dress and the appointments of women became also extravagantly luxurious. They were served on gold. In full dress, their persons were covered with jewels, and the wives of the rich, when they went out, were attended by well-dressed slaves. Leo Africanus provides the following information on the city. In Timbuktu, there are numerous judges, doctors, i.e. of letters, and clerics, all receiving good salaries from the king. He pays great respect to men of learning. There is a big demand for books and manuscript imported from Barbary, i.e. North Africa. More profit is made from the book trade than any other line of business. Jenne was an 8-gated city encircled by a rampart that could only be approached by crossing narrow streams and canals. Many of its buildings were attractive, with houses of 2 stories, often with indoor drainage systems. The Grand Mosque was outstanding. It was a huge monument then over 200 years old. It was a castle-like building with obeliskoid pillars built into its walls. Trade flourished in Jenne. Merchants brought salt from mines in Taghaza and gold from Bito to its markets. Leo Africanus, after revisiting Jenne, informs us of the continuing use of golden coins in the region. The coinage used to be these blacks is unstamped gold. They also use pieces of iron for the purchase of items of low value, such as milk, bread, and honey. These pieces weigh 1 pound, half a pound, and a quarter of a pound. Agadez had an estimated population of 70,000 people. Leo Africanus described it as a wealthy town boasting stately mansions in the Moorish style. Its inhabitants were typically foreign merchants, artificers, or government officials. The city had one famous old mosque, whose minaret continues to dominate the city's skyline. In 1529, Askia the Great was deposed by his son Musa. From that period until 1591, there was a great deal of political instability. Askia Musa, ruled 1529 to 1531, was a tyrant. He had many people assassinated, especially rivals to the throne. On one occasion, a Marabel approached the Askia and said the following to him: "We enjoy prosperity and repose in the reign of thy father, the happy, the good, and we made prayers that God might accord him in victory and a long life. We asked ourselves, has he a son who shall be the hope of Islam? And we answered, yes. So we offer prayers for thee as well as for thy father. Thou hast deceived our hopes, but we do not cease our prayers. Only instead of invoking God in thy favor, we pray against thee." The army overthrew him in 1531. The military leaders, led by Muhammad Bengen, ruled until 1537, but they too were overthrown, this time by Askia Ishmael. Ishmael's 2 years in power were spent fighting rebels. Askia Ishak I, the next ruler, established some stability, but only after eliminating his rivals. He led the empire from 1539 until 1549. Askia Daud became emperor in 1549. His military victories restored Songhai control over trade routes to the north. There were battles with the Masi, the Fulani, the Malians, Kebi, and Katsina. Duad was so sure of the bravery and fighting ability of his soldiers that he sent a raiding party of 24 horsemen to attack the hostile city of Katsina. These resolute men hurled themselves at 400 Katsina cavalrymen who had come out to engage them. Needless to say, Daud's men were beaten. 15 of them were killed in this struggle, and the 9 remaining were wounded and captured. The ruler of Katsina sent them back to the Daud with this message: "Men of such incomparable bravery do not deserve to die." In 1556, the Moroccans attacked Taghaza. They killed the Songhai governor of the city and a number of Tuaregs who were working in the salt caravans. The surviving traders petitioned Daud to abandon Taghaza for safer pastures. The Askia opened a new salt mine in 1557 where the old salt traders found work. Askia Daud was a fine administrator. He employed only trusted supporters to the key jobs in the government. Under his rule, trade and culture flourished. He repaired the university mosque and enlarged the Jingobere mosque, both in Timbuktu. The learned and the dutiful Qadi al-Aqib supervised these construction works. Scholarship also flourished, and the Daoud was a scholar himself. He founded libraries and employed scribes to transcribe important manuscripts. Following his victorious campaign against Mali in 1559, Askia Daoud married a Malian princess. According to As-Asadi, the great Songhai historian of the 17th century, Askia Daoud caused the princess to be conducted to Songhai in a sumptuous equipage. She was covered with jewels, surrounded by numerous slaves, both men and women, and provided with an abundant baggage train. All of the utensils were of gold: dishes, pitchers, pestle and mortar, everything. As Professor Diop points out, the princess then lived in a luxury comparable with that of Helen of Troy. In Morocco, there were a number of sinister developments. In 1577, Al-Mansur was the Sultan. Having deposed the black ruler Sultan Muhammad XI, Al-Mansur was seeking alliances to help build his kingdom. Queen Elizabeth I, the ruler of England, was looking for alliances to expand England into an empire. A match had been made. She secretly negotiated the supply of British timber to help build Morocco's navy. In return, the Queen had hoped that the Morocco would help her attack Spain. Al-Mansur just wasn't interested. His interest for war lay to the south. His gaze landed on the prosperous Songhai Empire. Here was his chance to mark his achievements in the history of his kingdom. In Songhai, Askia Daoud ruled until his death in 1582. Civil wars followed his death. During this period, the Moroccans sent a spying mission to the country. Major Dubois, author of the pioneering and scholarly Timbuktu the Mysterious, tells us that he sent an embassy in 1583, ostensibly charged with magnificent gifts, but in reality commissioned to reconnoiter the roads and principal towns of Songhois and make a study of its armies. Askia el-Hajj II received the embassy at Gao and returned it laden with gifts of still greater splendor than those it had brought. This was fuel to the flames. Askia al-Hajj Muhammad II, the victor of the Civil War, ruled for 4 years. Muhammad Bano succeeded him and ruled for 2 years. Stability only returned in 1588 when Askia Ishak II became emperor. West Africa's golden age was severely interrupted by an invasion from Morocco in 1591. A Moroccan source informs us that Al-Mansur spent many years convincing his council of war of this massive project. Their main fear was the death toll in crossing the Sahara. Prince, they replied, there is an immense desert between our country and the Sudan, i.e. West Africa, which is devoid of water and vegetation, and so hard to traverse that the very birds lose their way there. If these are all of your objections, replied Al-Mansur, I see no reason why they should hinder my resolution. The conquest itself will be an easy one, for the Sudanese know neither powder nor cannon, nor are they acquainted with the muskets of terrifying sound. They are only armed with spears and sabers, and what can they avail against us? Why should we make war against the Turk, who gives much trouble and little profit, when the Sudan would be an easy conquest and is richer than the whole of northern Africa? After persuading the Council of War and further years of planning, he wrote to Queen Elizabeth I on June 23, 1591, requesting England's assistance. The Queen was more than happy to supply men and weapons. The possible rewards of looting the Songhai Empire for its gold proved too great an opportunity to miss. Queen Elizabeth supplied artillery, cannonballs, guns, and soldiers. The lure of Songhai's wealth attracted other Europeans. In fact, of the 4,000 men in Al-Mansur's first division of the army, 2,500 were Europeans. The artillerymen were mostly English, and the commander of the army was a Spaniard named Judar Pasha. Professor de Graaf Johnson tells us that so ready were Europeans to enlist in this Moroccan army that Spanish became its official language. In October 1590, the Moroccan army under Judar Pasha and eunuch left to invade Songhai. The army consisted of 2,000 soldiers, 1,500 lancers, 500 cavalry, 1,000 camelmen, 8,000 camels, 1,000 pack horses, and 600 scouts. Presumably, the other 7,000 camels were laden with artillery and supplies. Guarding Judar Pasha was a personal unit of 70 trained bodyguards. The journey across the desert cost many lives. 1/3 of the army did not survive, but they continued their search towards Songhai. In February 1591, they reached the river Niger. Songhai scouts soon learned of the nature of the expedition and immediately raised the alarm. The Songhai War Council quickly assembled 18,000 cavalrymen and 9,700 soldiers who were led by Askia Ishak II. Songhai prepared to do battle. Judar Pasha, though vastly outnumbered, had the advantage. He had a large stock of guns, ammunition, and cannons. Songhai had none of these weapons. As the war commenced, vast numbers were brutally slain. After this initial victory, Judar Pasha pressed on. He sacked, pillaged, and burnt to the ground the cities of Jenne, Gao, and Timbuktu. His army filled in water wells and destroyed fields of crops. As-Sadi tells us that after the invasion, the high cost of food was excessive. A great number of people died from the hunger, and the famine was such that the people ate the corpses of draft animals and of human beings. The exchange rate fell to 500 calories. Then the plague came in turn to decimate the population and killed many of that the famine had spared. This high cost of food, which lasted 2 years, ruined the inhabitants, who were reduced to selling their furniture and utensils. All the elders were unanimous in saying that they had never seen such a calamity, and that not one of the elders before then had ever told them about anything like it. In Morocco, by contrast, things were very different. Al-Mansur received so much gold dust, musk, slaves, ebony, and other valuable objects, says the Moroccan Chronicle, that the envious are troubled and all the spectators are stupefied. He now pays his functionaries in pure metal of good weight, from which it would appear that he had not been above falsifying his coinage. There were 1,400 smiths in his palace, employed in making the gold into coins, while other portions of the treasure were converted into necklaces and jewels, and the name of El-Dekhebi, the Golden, was given to the Sultan. Great public rejoicings continued at Marrakesh during 3 days, and deputations came from all parts to offer congratulations. After the Moroccan invasion of 1591, their first commander, Judar Pasha, was dismissed. Judar had become ill, affected by a tropical disease. Many in his army suffered the same ailment. The Moroccans replaced him as a commander with another eunuch, Mohammed ben Zurgan. Mohammed led the troops to commit many brutal acts. One of these was the capture of the Sankore University professors. The arrest took place in late October 1593. The captured scholars were deported to Morocco in chains. Some of them were killed in a massacre along the way. Those that survived the journey were forced to serve the Moroccans. Others were imprisoned. The Moroccan army confiscated the libraries of the scholars. Professor Ahmed Baba, the head of the university, lost 1,600 books in this way. Other scholars, with even larger libraries, lost even more books. In the words of Her Ladyship, while other forms of wealth were greedily appropriated, the contents of libraries were destroyed. The sack of Timbuktu was the signal for the letting loose of all evils of lawless tyranny upon the country. From this time, the history of the region becomes a mere record of riot, robbery, and decadence. But that was not all. Professor Diop laments on the loss of the judicial and administrative archives. Assistants of the caddies kept minutes of the sessions, but tons of documents have disappeared. On a brighter note, however, Professor Henry Louis Gates, the noted African-American scholar, has recently shown that thousands of these old manuscripts still exist in private libraries of leading Timbuktu families. The challenge is now to have the manuscripts cataloged and then translated. Professor Baba enjoyed a very high reputation in the Islamic world. Amongst the Songhai, he was known as the unique pearl of his time. In a Moroccan text from the period, the praise for him was even more gushing. He is described as the Imam, the erudite, the high-minded, the eminent among scholars, Abu el-Abbas Ahmed Baba. In Morocco, the Arab scholars petitioned to have him released from jail. He was released a year after his arrival on May 9th, 1596. Major Dubois narrates that all the believers were greatly pleased with his release, and he was conducted in triumph from his prison to the principal mosque of Marrakesh. A great many of the learned men urged him to open a course of instruction. His first thought was to refuse, but overcome by their persistence, he accepted a post in the mosque of the caliphs and taught rhetoric, law, and theology. An extraordinary number of pupils attended his lectures, and questions of the gravest importance were submitted to him by the magistracy, his decision always being treated as final. Despite the adulation, Baba was careful to credit his learning to the Almighty and thus maintain his modesty. A Moroccan source tells of an audience he obtained with Al-Mansur. It appears that the scholar gave the Sultan something of a dressing down. Baba complained about the Sultan's lack of manners, his ill treatment received during his original arrest, the sacking of his private library, and the destruction of Shanghai. We are told by Moroccan author that Al-Mansur, being unable to reply to any of this, put an end to the audience. The professor was detained in Morocco for a total of 12 years. Eventually, he received permission from Al-Mansur's successor to return to Shanghai. Just before his departure across the desert, he vowed in the presence of the leading scholars of Marrakesh, who had gathered to give him a send-off, "May God never bring me back to this meeting, nor make me return to this country." He returned to a devastated Timbuktu and died there in 1627. In closing, we give the final word to Professor Ahmed Baba, who has left us the following sketch of his tutor, Professor Muhammad Abu Bekr of Saincourt. Abu Bekr, the great master, would appear to have been a useful representative of the scholarly life of the university. He taught his pupils to love science, wrote Baba, to follow its teachings, to devote their time to it, and to associate with scholars. He lavishly lent his most precious books, rare copies, and the volumes he most valued, and never asked for them again, no matter what was the subject or which they had treated. Sometimes the student would present himself at the door and ask for a book, and he would give it to them without even knowing who the man was. He had a passion for books. He collected them with ardor, both buying and causing them to be copied.